Can't get out of my bed. There's a thought crime running through my head. Can't take these rules, and people are fools who believe what they read and believe what they see, believe what they see on the TV. Opinions are like iPhones.
Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Glass Onion on John Lennon. Thanks for some of the feedback on episode 1. I've had some private messages about it. It was just an introduction, get the ball rolling. Someone did describe my voice as soothing, a friend of mine, which I took as a compliment, although I'm wondering whether it might be a voice that's putting people to sleep. I did decide actually I'm going to speed up a little bit on this one and change my vocal style. I'm sure it will develop over time anyway. So, perversely, here we are starting with the last day of John Lennon's life, which was December the 8th, 1980. But in the next episode, I am actually going to be posting an interview I did with one of the original Quarrymen, one of John Lennon's former bandmates. So we're kind of going back to the beginning. But, the reason I'm doing this episode about the last day of his life was because it was a blog post I wrote a few years ago that I did an audio version of, which I wasn't ultimately too pleased with in terms of my voice. So I'm redoing it now with slightly better technology as well. So basically I'll be reading it and then interjecting. Hopefully it'll be obvious when I'm reading it and when I'm interjecting. If anyone has never heard of Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, it's a podcast I massively recommend if you have any interest in history. He's an absolute master podcaster. And he has this thing he does where if he's quoting somebody, he'll change his voice quite markedly. Like his voice becomes more excitable when he's talking about something like quoting something about World War One. He did a huge series on that. So anyway, that's the way it'll be going. So I'm going to get going with the blog post and then put in a few thoughts in between the paragraphs. So, the rather strange last day in the life of John Lennon, written and read by Anthony. First, the facts as they are known. John Lennon was born in 1940 and died in 1980, 2 months after his 40th birthday. It's fair to say that he packed a lot of living into his half a lifetime, and it's also universally acknowledged that his death in New York on Monday, December the 8th, 1980, came as a huge shock worldwide, prompting a mass outpouring of grief which seemed to be particularly strong in America, more so than in England, the place of Lennon's birth. Inevitably there have been rumours about whether it really was a lone assassin, as seems to be so often the case in high-profile American murder cases, or another hand. But it's fair to say that Lennon and Yoko Ono almost certainly didn't know that anything out of the ordinary was going to happen on that day. So a couple of comments on that. So as I've said, I'm not going to be looking at alternative theories regarding Lennon's death. I think there is certainly a case for examining those, and of course the lone assassin theory was used to justify but to explain the killings of JFK, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, 3 massive high-profile cases of the 1960s, all of which, in my opinion, are highly questionable in terms of the official versions. So the reaction to John Lennon's death, as I've said, I'm really going by stuff I've read and people I've talked to who said that there seemed to be a stronger reaction in America. I think that may have a lot to do with the culture anyway. Perhaps you could very much generalise and say that Americans have stronger reactions than English people, and I know from growing up in England we tend to want to downplay things, or we have sort of cooler attitudes about things, although I'm sure there was a big reaction in England. Now, as regards how John Lennon was remembered, it seemed almost instantly he was remembered as a peacenik, and as I discussed in the first episode, there were so many John Lennons that you could pick multiple ones to encapsulate the man, or perhaps none of them encapsulate, as I said before. So I think it's no surprise that the world chose to remember the peace guy, because everybody wants peace. As Paul recently said, people want peace. But you never really know how people are going to react. And of course, 17 years after John Lennon's death, there came Princess Diana's death in a tunnel in Paris in a car crash. Again, slightly questionable, but anyway. I'll do an episode actually on alternative theories. I'm going to call them that instead of conspiracy theories. Alternative theories or explanations of John Lennon's death. That will be an episode in the future, so watch this space. But yeah, with Princess Diana, I don't think anybody quite expected such an outpouring, again, particularly in England. So you never quite know how that's going to go. Anyway, what's also strange about that day is that it seemed to play out as both a microcosm of and epilogue to Lennon's life, as will be seen. It might be expected that on an otherwise ordinary day in the life of a rock superstar, the star himself would not be particularly visible, and we probably wouldn't have photos of him, audio of his voice, or a picture of him signing an autograph for a fan. But we have all three and more. Lennon's movements on that day, up to the moment of truth, are now well known. He started the day with coffee at La Fortuna, a favourite local cafe of his, and the events of the rest of the day make quite eerie reading in retrospect. So yeah, quite strange to have so much documentation of this day. I mean, John Lennon had just made a comeback after 5 years, so I suppose he was in a high-profile situation, but in many other ways it was just a run-of-the-mill Monday in December in New York. So anyway, the haircut. Fairly innocuous in itself, but Lennon happened to choose this day to have a throwback 50s style faux teddy boy haircut, as well as wearing a leather jacket throughout the day. The 50s were his years of teenage development, the seminal period of his life, and his love for Elvis, Chuck Berry, Little Richard and the rest were some of the main reasons why ultimately the Beatles happened. He had recently taken to wearing his old school tie and had recorded his comeback single, Just Like Starting Over, in a vocal style that he called Elvis Orbison. So yes, this is absolutely true. He did get a haircut that looked very much like the one he had at the Woolton Village Fete where he met Paul McCartney back in 1957. So almost like going full circle, really. And then having the leather jacket as well. John Lennon, I think it's fair to say, never was a teddy boy, so I described it as a faux teddy boy haircut. I think he was always a faux teddy boy, or a wannabe, you might say. The thing about him wearing his old school tie is very interesting. I wonder whether he hit 40, and I hit 40 a couple of years ago myself. It does make you reflect, even though anyone who knows John Lennon will know that he wasn't a big fan of school. He seemed to see through it pretty quickly. Interesting that he started wearing that tie. The photo shoot. In the late morning, John and Yoko did a photo session with well-known New York photographer Annie Leibovitz. Easily the most famous shot to emerge from this session was one of a fully naked John Lennon in a fetal embrace with a fully clad Yoko Ono. "That's it. That's our relationship," said Lennon after the photo had been posed for. And on the blog post you can see a link to that photo. Quite amazing for a high-profile celebrity to be this literally naked. Of course, as I'll read in a minute, it wasn't the first time that he and Yoko had appeared on an album cover naked. And the fact that he said, that's our relationship, basically a sort of childlike naked dependency on his wife, I think is very interesting considering the John and Yoko myth, I would call it. I don't think the beginning of the relationship was a myth, but I think towards the end there was a bit of myth-making going on, which John Lennon promoted a lot, but then there's him saying that they're not equals, in fact. In a way, it was a sort of fetal relationship. It seemed that they were not particularly sexually active at that time, although, of course, they conceived Sean. So I think there was a sort of psychological dependency, and May Pang talked about this a lot in her book, originally called Loving John. And her theory really is that that's the reason that he went back to Yoko, whether he was hypnotised or not. Literally hypnotised or symbolically hypnotised, who knows, but I think that was very telling. The idea of being a naked artist, both literally, artistically and spiritually, had been perhaps the second great theme of Lennon's life and work after rock and roll. In the mid-60s, after the thrill of Beatles fame had long since become more of an empty irritation than a glorious thrill, he had gone into a drug-addled period of seclusion, broken only by Beatle commitments, before he started a relationship with Yoko, who, like or a hater, did seem to bring him back to life. From then to the end of his life, he considered himself an artist, open to ideas and willing to lay himself bare, literary or otherwise, before his audience. He had, of course, been pictured naked before, with Yoko in a similar state, for the cover of their barely listenable concept art album, Two Virgins. At that time, the picture seemed to be of two people reduced to a childlike state of innocence in the glow of their new love, but 12 years later, with Lennon alone in the virginal state, and having dubbed Yoko Mother some years back, the balance of power in their relationship seemed clear. John and Yoko had only recently shot a video of themselves naked, simulating lovemaking to promote one of their latest songs. So, quite a bit to get into there. In the mid-60s, 65, 66, 67, John Lennon was working with the Beatles, but it seemed that he spent a lot of time in a stupor, generally taking marijuana, LSD, and then of course we know he went on to later things. But I think, a lot of people would say that Yoko Ono ruined John Lennon or ruined his music. And it may be that, later on his music did get less inspired. I do like a lot of his solo stuff. But I think, if it hadn't been for the relationship with Yoko, we wouldn't have had John Lennon's contributions to the White Album, or not in the form that they came out. Something like Happiness is a Warm Gun, and of course Revolution 9, which I personally love. A lot of people don't, but that's fine. And I think she did save him, because there's an interview I remember hearing with Mike Love of the Beach Boys, who went to India with the Beatles and Donovan in '68. And he said that around the time of Sgt. Pepper, he remembered seeing a picture of John Lennon and thinking that this guy just looked in an absolute mess. It was and Mike Love had this horrible feeling that he was going to be dead soon. Could have joined the 27 Club, in fact. So, and if you look at photos of John Lennon at the launch party of Sgt. Pepper, which was May '67 at Brian Epstein's house in Belgravia, he really does look, frankly, terrible. And again, his drug taking will probably be an episode in the future. But I think Yoko did save him in some respect. And then, of course, the argument is then that she got him into heroin, which I think is questionable, debatable, let's say. So, and this idea of being an artist, I think she did broaden his idea of what being an artist was. And I recently read a book called The Beatles and the Avant-Garde. I'm blanking on the author's name, but definitely check that book out. It's a wonderful bit of work. It's a fairly short book, easy to digest. But really, you do get from that the fact that Yoko Ono did broaden things out for him, so he could just be an artist. And if that meant screaming her name for 12 minutes, or making a fairly conventional rock and roll song, or combining the two, then it was like anything goes. And I think John Lennon kind of needed that. What her effect was on him in the end is, as I said, we could debate that at another point. The interview. Between 1 and 4 p.m. on December the 8th, 1980, Dave Sholin became the recipient of John Lennon's final interview, held in one of the vast rooms of John and Yoko's many apartments in the Gothic Dakota building, located at West 72nd Street, New York, and formerly the setting for the film Rosemary's Baby, made in 1968 by Roman Polanski. 1 year after the film, Polanski's pregnant wife Sharon Tate was butchered by the Manson family, who wrote in Tate's blood near her body, Helter Skelter, the name of a Beatles song from their most recent album. Lennon was late getting back for the interview, apologising and announcing that Annie Leibovitz had wanted one more shot before he was free to leave. Yoko had taken the floor before his arrival. In the 3-hour Sholin interview, John Lennon, with literally hours to live, ran through a potted history of his whole life, from his troubled family history to the famous meetings with Paul McCartney and Yoko Ono to his hopes for the future of himself and mankind. Towards the end of the interview, John Lennon announced that, "I always consider my work to be one piece and it won't be finished until I'm dead and buried, and I hope that's a long, long time." Lennon seemed upbeat to all who knew him at this time, while others believe he was actually clinically depressed and addicted to very potent pharmaceuticals. His excessively thin frame was either the result of a healthy diet or heroin. At this very moment in time, a 25-year-old from Georgia, now based in Hawaii, a world away from the superstar John Lennon in terms of status and the love of others, was very close to him, standing outside the Dakota apartment chatting to other fans, as well as an amateur photographer of Lennon's acquaintance called Paul Goresh. Mark David Chapman, by his own admission, was holding a gun in his pocket in the crisp December air, waiting for one of the voices in his head, God or Satan, to step forward and help determine the course of his actions and his and Lennon's destinies, just as Lennon spoke those last words. So yeah, quite amazing to have this interview. As I just said, I mean, it was a vast interview, about 3 hours, although some of it involved only Yoko. And of course, that famous line I've said, my work won't be finished till I'm dead and buried, that was right at the end of the interview. I don't know if the full interview is actually available online, but I listened to it a few years ago, and it's of course, in retrospect, everything he's saying is very eerie, because sometimes he's hinting at, borrowed time. He had a song called Living on Borrowed Time, of course. And then he's talking about, we're going to be touring in 1981, which was, coming a month later. At all this time, there's this young man, Mark David Chapman, who is planning to do this awful deed that he will do later. Now, of course, again, there's a debate now more and more about what state John Lennon was in around that time. And, he was very thin, and this could be, macrobiotic diet or heroin or some other drug. And the other thing about him is that in those final interviews, Albert Goldman got in a lot of trouble for saying that he sounded like he was coked up, doing cocaine. But to be honest, he sounds very speedy, and some people would say that's because of the dawn of the second wave of his life. Life begins at 40 and all that. But I think if you really analyse what he says in these final interviews, there's plenty of edge still there, and there's a fatalistic thing which Fred Seaman touched on in his book Living on Borrowed Time, which again I recommend. So who knows? I said, I don't think that John Lennon really knew what was going to happen that day. People have taught that he had premonitions, that he might die a violent death. Maybe that was because he knew he was famous and he knew, being anti-war, he knew how the government operated, and maybe he thought, something might happen to him. And of course he had this crazy Beatles fame. He was fully aware of all of that. So I'm sure that was always in the back of his mind. So on we go. The autograph. At around 5 p.m, Lennon's and Chapman's worlds collided for the first time. John Ono Lennon, world superstar and cultural icon, a man prone to depression and mood swings, stepped out of the Dakota apartments with his wife on his way to a recording studio. Mark David Chapman, a nobody who had previously attempted suicide and was a man prone to depression and mood swings, stood outside the same building. Suddenly, out of nowhere, there he was, the superstar, the icon, and Chapman froze. His first instinct was not to draw his gun. He simply froze like any awed fan face to face with John Lennon. He'd bought Lennon's latest album, Double Fantasy, the day before, and as Lennon approached, he wordlessly thrust the album in front of him. Lennon dutifully signed the album John Lennon 1980. Amateur photographer Goresh, an opportunist who'd once posed as a delivery man in order to get into the Dakota, saw his opportunity and snapped the final pictures of John Lennon alive, signing an autograph for the man who would soon end his life. In the picture, Chapman's smile/smirk could be equally interpreted as a devilish appreciation of what was to happen later, or simply that of a fan, his demons temporarily set aside, happy to get his album signed by the man himself. One source has stated that Chapman asked Lennon for a job during their encounter, but this is unverified. It's also been written that after giving the autograph, Lennon asked Chapman, "Is that all you want?" And some even go further and have Lennon asking him a second time, and there being a moment suspended in time, as if Lennon had some mystical or at least vibrational awareness of something fated. So, first of all, I am mentioning the name Mark David Chapman. A lot of people don't want to say his name, or in fact that of Albert Goldman. And, that would be a long tangent to go on, but I really don't see that denying that this guy existed is really helping anything. And I think some people do believe that there's a personal relationship that goes on between stars and their fans, and that John Lennon was actually writing songs for us. I think no less than Paul McCartney has said that he makes music for himself. Obviously, he wants to have an appreciation for the fans because they're the reason he exists in the first place. But I think this sort of personal relationship, really, if you think about it, celebrities have become the new gods. So a lot of people in ancient times and now believe they have a personal communication with God, which is fine, but, God is not a figure that you see on the television every day. You don't see all the flaws of him. Whereas celebrities, you can see that they're flawed human beings. But some people, I'm not naming any names, but there are certain fans on forums, you see, they just do not want to hear a word against this man. And that's not the angle I'm taking with John Lennon. I think that's not the angle John Lennon would have wanted me or anyone else to take. So I'm mentioning Mark David Chapman because he's a product of our society, like it or not, a warped product of our society. But I hate the action he did as much as anyone else, but I don't think just blind hatred of him, I don't find it helpful. Now, of course, I think if you were intimately involved with the event, in other words, someone close to John Lennon, then I think their reaction would be totally justified. Anyway, that's a tangent, but I am going to be mentioning his name. Now, as far as this autograph, it hasn't really been verified that Chapman asked Lennon for a job, and the thing about Is That All You Want? There was a movie, Chapter 23, not really a great film. very kind of a bit of a Hollywood version. But anyway, and in that one, John Lennon asked Mark Chapman, "Is that what you want?" And then asks him again. So I don't know where that came from. Maybe that was that film, or maybe someone had mentioned it before. So the recording session. John Lennon went to the Hit Factory to record guitar on Yoko Ono's Walking on Thin Ice, his final contribution to the music business. Chapman waited with Goresh, who eventually left for the night. Many hours later, at 10:50 p.m, Chapman saw Lennon's limousine approach from the distance and park by the curb outside the Dakota. Yoko got out first, quite a way ahead of John, and passed Chapman. Lennon passed him next, and may or may not have acknowledged him, and at this point Chapman fired the shots heard around the world. Lennon's painfully thin frame was no match for the hollow point bullets of the .38 Charter Arms pistol, which ripped through him and sealed his fate. He had enough left to moan, "I'm shot," but was DOA at nearby Roosevelt Hospital 20 minutes later. As if the day couldn't get any stranger, Chapman, upon shooting the star, simply put the smoking gun down by his feet and started reading The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, a book he had become seemingly obsessed with over the previous 2 years. So John Lennon, sporting his vintage rock and roll haircut and leather jacket, having given the world a final set of pictures and a retrospective interview encompassing most of his life story and signed an autograph for the worst kind of fan, was gone. As a final expression of how media dominated the world had become even then, there was one more John Lennon photo taken that day before his cremation. I have attached that photo, but I'm not going to recommend you look at it. It's a very grisly photo. The world chose to remember him as a saint, something that Astrid Kircher, who'd befriended the young Beatles in Hamburg, thought he would have found quite amusing. By the way, that was taken from a Beatles convention I went to where Astrid was interviewed, and she said that John Lennon would have found it very amusing that he was considered now a saint. Now, as regards Chapman and The Catcher in the Rye, there is a very good documentary on YouTube called The Man Who Shot John Lennon, which takes a very rounded view of this and is a book about, as it says, the danger of stories and the danger of how art can influence people in the worst ways. Very ironic, of course, that it was a work of art that prompted the killer to kill a famous musical artist. Chapman has now served 30 years in Attica prison, mostly in solitary confinement. Such is the nature of his crime and the person he killed, he will probably never be released. Is this right when others have done similar things to nobodies and served far less time? It is thought that if he was released, one of those misguided Beatles fans, young or old, who really thinks that John Lennon wrote songs for them and them alone, might earn himself a life sentence for an act of retribution. It should be remembered that in the end, however gifted, John Lennon was just a man, all too human. So perhaps this is above all a story of the power of celebrity. That is a reality, that if you do become a high-profile murderer, or by killing somebody high-profile, or just by the heinousness of your crimes, people in England will know of the Moors murders, you're not going to serve the sentence that's normally handed down. A life sentence normally means in England, for example, 25 years, 30 years perhaps. I don't think Mark Chapman is going to get out. He's been up for parole on numerous occasions, always been turned down. As I said, the fear is that someone will try to kill him or at least attack him. And as far as celebrities go, I mean, people have always worshipped gods, and as I may have said earlier, I think that celebrities are some kind of substitute for that. But the difference is really you can see celebrities, although you're not really seeing their actual lives, you're seeing some version of it on the television, in the media. You could say that they are flawed, and as I said, some people don't want to hear a word against John Lennon, but I think he was just a man, and he wore his flaws on his sleeve. He was honest in many ways. He knew how to play the media game as well, but he was aware of his own humanity, and he was aware of his own deficiencies. So, postscript. As if the story needed any more bizarre twists, how about this recollection from a rock journalist interviewing David Bowie recently? Quote, "I've been rattled more than once by a revelation from a musician for which there had been no previous report, but none more sobering than the one David Bowie gave me when the recording machine was turned off. According to Bowie, New York City police discovered that his name was second on a hit list of targets of John Lennon's assassin, Mark David Chapman. At the time of Lennon's murder outside of his Manhattan apartment, David Bowie was starring just blocks away on Broadway in the play The Elephant Man. I was second on his list, Bowie told me in the New York studio we shared near Madison Square Garden. Chapman had a front row ticket to the Elephant Man the next night. John and Yoko were supposed to sit front row for that show too. So the night after John was killed, there were 3 empty seats in the front row. I can't tell you how difficult that was to go on. I almost didn't make it through the performance. The irony is that David Bowie's first #1 hit, Fame, from the Young Americans album, was co-written with Lennon, who also played guitar on the track. And it was indeed their fame as rock stars that drew Mark David Chapman to stalk them and subsequently to murder Lennon. I've never heard David Bowie actually refer to that in an interview, and that was off the record. Perhaps he just doesn't want to talk about it. Perhaps even for someone like Bowie, who I imagine had experienced almost anything, almost nothing was too crazy for him. That must have been genuinely chilling and shocking for him. So I haven't been able to verify whether that's actually true about the 3 empty seats, but Bowie was definitely starring in The Elephant Man around that time. So who knows? I'm sure that will come out. I mean, the last few years has been incredible for John Lennon and Beatles fans in terms of the amount of information, new information that's come out. And I think some of the best books around the Beatles and Lennon are being written, have been written and are being written at the moment, So, in conclusion, I think there's plenty to talk about there. I would welcome any feedback, any comments, positive and negative. You can tell me what I'm doing right and what I'm doing wrong. I did actually have this audio version. It's still up on YouTube, in fact, on my YouTube channel, which is Contrafib. It was divided into parts, and one of the parts has had something like 8,500 views the last time I checked. He's obviously a compelling subject, and this part of his life is quite contentious and naturally arouses quite strong feelings. So anyway, I've put the email address on the description box, and obviously this will be posted on Facebook. I will get involved with other social media at some point, but I'm keeping it low-key at the moment. So anyway, on to the next episode. As I mentioned earlier, it's going to be with one of John Lennon's former bandmates in the Quarrymen. I recorded it a few weeks ago. I had a really great Skype talk with the man in question. And so that'll be online next Friday. I'm going to be getting them out every Friday, at least for the next couple of months, because I've stockpiled a few episodes. And we'll see what happens after that. So thanks very much for listening, and I'll see you again soon. Goodbye.
I'm prepared for death because I don't believe in it. I think it's just getting out of one car and getting into another.